Dr. Kee Jim founded Feedlot Health Management Services shortly after graduating. He sold that company to TELUS in 2020, but that's just one part of his many successes in building businesses in the cattle industry.
In this consulting game, you're selling brains by the bucket, right? And you're always going to sell it at a very large discount to its true value. So that provided me considerable motivation to look at other ways of fully monetizing the information. And it became obvious to me the only way you could do that was by owning the cattle.
Today, Kee sits down with Jeanette Barnard to talk about how he approaches business and investing in the cattle industry. He shares principles that have made him successful through the good times and the bad.
Pretty much everything that could go wrong went wrong, but it was an eye-opener in the sense that you better be thinking about how do you mitigate some of the risk here, what can you do? Because up until that point in time, I paid no attention to risk management of any kind because your returns wide open in the cash market had been so good.
Dr. Kee Jim, who I told Jeanette reminds me of the Charlie Munger of the cattle industry, on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the farmers, founders, innovators, and investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. And we have a really cool episode here today, a ton of wisdom in today's episode. But first, I want to take just a moment to recognize our quarterly presenting sponsor this quarter, which is Case IH. As most of you know, I'm fascinated by the way technology and innovation are shaping the future of agriculture. Hence, that's why I do this podcast. And it's also why I'm really excited to partner with Case IH this quarter. Case IH designs, engineers, and produces cutting-edge farm equipment based on a comprehensive understanding of farmers' needs, wants, and challenges, integrating these insights into their development and manufacturing. For example, take their model year 25 Magnum tractor. The new Magnum is purposefully designed to answer farmers' needs in every design and engineering choice. Improved horsepower for pulling heavier loads faster, bundled, integrated, and ready-to-go precision tech for greater accuracy in the field, and a transmission farmers can tweak for improved control and performance in different tasks. That kind of design thinking is exactly where the future of ag is headed, and that's why you'll be hearing me talk to a few folks at Case IH at different points throughout this quarter about what they do and how they're working to push ag forward. Thanks again to Case IH for their leadership in ag innovation and for supporting the Future of Agriculture podcast. All right, now back to today's episode with Dr. Kee Jim, the founder and entrepreneur behind Feedlot Health Management Services and also just general cattle feeding entrepreneur. Really lucky to have Kee on the show, and it's only possible because my guest host for today's episode, Jeanette Barnard, made it happen. Jeanette, always a pleasure to have you on the show to co-host or guest host episodes, and really appreciate you bringing us this one.
Thanks for having me. I love these episodes because it gives me a chance to talk to people who are incredibly smart and have great stories. And chief among them is Kee Jim, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I could make a list several pages long of what I enjoyed and took away from today's episode, but I don't want to steal any of your thunder. Why don't we hear from you first? You know, what was it that caused you to want to reach out to Kee and make an episode about this?
So I have kind of followed Kee's path over the last several years from a lot of different dimensions. And what's so fascinating about what Kee has built, and what I think your listeners are really going to enjoy hearing, is that this is a guy who built one of the earliest ag tech companies in the livestock space. It wasn't venture backed. He built it super early on in his career coming out of vet school. This is a guy who has done business model innovation, both with his company Feedlot Health, but now also as he has gotten into the further along in the cattle feeding space, and even now to his current project, the new feed yard that he has built, and going all in on the beef on dairy space and how they're thinking about individual animals and how to, really optimize that business. I mean, there's just a lot of different dimensions to Kee's story, and that's what I think makes it so informative and entertaining and compelling. And there are lessons for everyone in listening to Kee Jim's story.
Yeah, there absolutely are. And I think we can make a whole nother episode about this episode, but I think the listeners probably just want to hear it straight from his mouth here. But if someone has never heard of Kee Jim or Feedlot Health, what should they kind of know before they enter into this interview?
So what Kee Jim has built originally was the company Feedlot Health, and that was a complete business model innovation on how to manage animal health in feed yards. Included a lot of elements of data capture, of software, of rethinking the entire business model of that interaction between veterinarian and the cattle feeder. And that then led to a career of actually feeding cattle and a number of feed yard acquisitions, and now to culminating with his latest project, which is going to be the largest cattle feed yard in America, and really just a complete flip on the traditional business model of feeding cattle.
Right. Well, I definitely think if you're at all interested in cattle, if you're at all interested in investing, because he is sort of a sage investor in kind of when to invest. If you're at all interested in ag business in general, you're going to love this. So here is Jeanette's interview with Kee Jim.
I went to the University of Saskatchewan and graduated in 1983 with a veterinary degree. And I came to Calgary, Alberta immediately after graduation and started a company called Feedlot Health Management Services. And you can tell by the title, it was a company that was focused on providing veterinary services to the emerging feedlot industry in Western Canada. At the same time, I got involved in cattle ownership and started Kee Jim Farms roughly around the same time. So I got involved, very early in the cattle feeding operations in Western Canada. And then if we wind the clock through several decades, Feedlot Health expanded from an animal health base and became involved in being a one-stop shop for consultation. We expanded to a multidisciplinary group of scientists with expertise in veterinary medicine, nutrition, cattle, sorting, environmental compliance, and we hired statisticians, epidemiologists, and all of the appropriate people to be doing data analytics across all areas of procurement, production, and marketing in feedlots. So it went from a single person to roughly a staff of 150, about a third of which were professional scientists. And that company 3 years ago was sold in its entirety to TELUS Agriculture. We go back to the Kee Jim Farm side, as they started off with a small percentage of a share pen, right? So it was 6% of a share pen of 300, and the 90% financed by the feedlot, so representing a net equity of about 2 head. But things were phenomenal here in Western Canada in terms of profitability. And over, the next several decades, I grew Kee Jim Farms into a major cattle owner. And starting about 20 years ago, I ventured into the U.S. side in terms of cattle ownership, and later in the business model, acquisition of feedlots, which was not part of my game plan early, because the rewards or the return to capital and simply on the cattle was far better than on the farming and feedlot operations. But we did become involved in that over time. Currently, we have feedlot operations in Texas, in New Mexico, in Colorado, and we have calf depots from coast to coast where we collect up day olds and bring them into our calf rearing systems. And recently, we opened a large feedlot in Nebraska of 150,000 head in our Blackshirt project. So that's more than 2 minutes, but I tried.
Well, it's kind of tough to condense a career like that into 2 minutes anyway. So that is perfect. We're going to double click on all of that, but let's start with Feedlot Health. So tell us more about the specifics of why did you start it? What was your insight? How did you start it?
It really started when I was in veterinary college. Quite frankly, after the first couple of years or the first year and a half of vet school, I wasn't convinced that this was my calling necessarily, right? So I was looking around just seeing, well, what are the opportunities? What can people with an interest in beef cattle, where are they going to end up? And I was frankly quite horrified to find out what, the life of a beef cattle veterinarian looked like. And remember, this is 40 years ago, right? And it looked like a lot of effort in terms of, making calls and doing a bunch of tasks, preg checking cows, the dystocia, all this kind of stuff. Almost all the things I was trying to avoid by moving away from the ranch, right? So I'm thinking that this is probably not a good fit for me. But fortunately, I encountered a professor by the name of Eugene Jansen, who's acted as a mentor for me just about my whole life. And he was getting involved in the emerging feedlot industry in Saskatchewan. So he had a lot of contacts with feedlot owners, and he was doing, the veterinary work at those feedlots. So I got very interested in that because what I could see is that it had scale, and these operations, could grow to be sizable, and they were also making money, right? Which wasn't something I was convinced that cow-calf producers were necessarily doing. So just really first principles, right? Service businesses that are profitable. And by doing so, you have a much better chance of success. So I figured, well, I really want to get involved in this feedlot thing and provide, veterinary services to feedlots. So I got focused on that in vet college and did some traveling. And in Alberta, which was a much bigger center of feedlot activity, it struck me that the veterinary practitioners were in the general practice mode, right? They hadn't recognized this emerging large-scale industry, and that the attributes required to service it would be very different than what they had done in mixed animal practice, right? So I guess my insight was that I knew that there was an opportunity because the current practitioners weren't really recognizing it as a big deal, and that this thing was going to really become something. So at that point in time, then I could hardly wait to get out because I thought, well, this is a pretty good opportunity that's just sitting right there. And at the same time, I think the second insight was there's going to be a lot of data here, and how are we going to collect this data, and how it's going to be analyzed, and how is the data going to lead to usable insights. So I got involved in, Eugene had a computer program, which was the data was collected in the field, and then via cards, it came into the veterinary college and was entered into a mainframe system. So a pretty awkward system, but what it taught me was that really wasn't going to work very well because of time lags and all the stuff. I felt that it had to be chute side, right? And you had to figure out a way of getting, data collection systems, computers chute side. And in 1985, a couple of years after graduation, that became possible with the advent of the IBM PC, right? So suddenly you were able to, collect data chute side. But the first system that we put in on a single hospital, it was $12,000, right? Just to give you an idea. And remember, that wasn't a network. That was a standalone system. So a lot of people, they just take it for granted that, the data flow existed. Well, it didn't at that point in time. And by understanding that was going to be required, and made the efforts to develop software. So I got involved in software development in 1984, and was able to put, the first system chute side in 1985. I'm not a computer programmer. I hired people to get this done. So that was the beginning of our proprietary software package that ultimately, expanded into all aspects of feedlot production. But I also think that equally as important would have been the really changing the veterinary client relationship, because I could see that, the standard fee for service, if I was going to get paid by the postmortem and called when the feedlot owner perceived that I was needed, wasn't going to be a very viable model for either myself or for the client, right? So we had to get to something different than fee for service or fee for hours. And that's where I decided that I need to be charged out on a per head per day basis. A common metric in feedlots is the cattle feeding day. We calculate everything basis cattle feeding days. So I thought, well, I need to be attached to that number, and I need to be paid, basis cattle feeding days, so that there was a mutual alignment of incentives between myself and the feedlot owner. So again, that idea was pretty attractive to the feedlots, right? Because it was an entirely different business model than they were used to, and they could see very clearly how great alignment could occur when you change the whole nature of that interaction. So really a couple of things: changing the nature of the business structure, using data, and then very shortly thereafter, creating significant research programs at all of the feedlots. We used the large pen model. It's not like we had a separate research facility. We just utilized what we had and, pioneered the large pen assessments that are common today. And very quickly realized that, we were generating, IP, we were generating knowledge that was immediately translatable. It's not like we're analyzing data and coming up with nothing in terms of recommendations or how to change. All of that work that we did and in the work we do today can result in a change in our operational procedures at the feedlot or in our production practices. So I was just looking at it here a little while ago. We've literally done thousands of research projects across multiple feedlots over a 40-year period. So a real key thing, data and research, driving the engine of change and the underlying business model.
And it's incredible to me that you stumbled across these three insights in your 20s, in your early 20s. So the data and the analytics piece is obviously super fascinating here, but also just the business model component that you talked about of aligning your incentives with your customers. Would you call that outcome-based pricing? And if so, outcome-based pricing seems like it's one of the holy grails of any innovative business model, but it's super, super, super difficult to execute. So what are the principles that you used in implementing that pricing model?
It's closer to outcome-based, but interestingly enough, there's been very few feedlots that are interested in paying by the outcome, right? Because depending on what portion of the delta that goes to the consultant, that program could be a lot more expensive than a per head day rate. Because very early in this thing, I was told by a feedlot operator who became a mentor and a good friend. He said, in this consulting game, you're selling brains by the bucket, right? And you're always going to sell it at a very large discount to its true value, just by the nature of the business. So that provided me considerable motivation to look at other ways of fully monetizing the information. And it became obvious to me the only way you could do that was by owning the cattle, right? In a sense, becoming your own best client, right? Because that way you don't get a discount. That the value of the information is X per head, you're getting it all. So it was a major reason why I got involved in the feeding of the cattle and the ownership of feedlots and so on, was to fully monetize the value of the information.
Okay, that's a super interesting point. So just to kind of set the contrast then, over these 40 years, I've heard you say before, as you said earlier a few moments ago, that when you first started in Canada, that feeding cattle was very profitable. So give us a contrast of, like, on a per head basis, what was a profit target 40 years ago versus what would be a profit target as an average today?
Well, we didn't really have a target, but the reality of it was that it was early in a new business in an area that had many natural advantages, right? So the return on equity was 30 and 40%, and on a per head basis, 40 years ago, we were making up to $200. So, just if you put that in today's context, you'd have to be making $800 a head, right? So there was a very good return, but it was because we had the lowest feed grain prices in the world with, barley production, and we were given an additional incentive by the government to use feed grains domestically. As opposed to export enhancement, they paid for domestic utilization. I was looking at one of the first closeouts of the cattle I was involved in 1984, and the net cost of the grain was $60 a ton, right? Well, it's pretty easy to make money when it's $60 a ton. And also, we had an abundant supply of feeder cattle, in a sense, an oversupply, because we were sending lots of feeder cattle to the US. And we had a shortage of high quality grain fed beef in Canada. So our basis was better. Selling fat cattle were higher in Canada than they were in the US. So you had everything going for you, right? And in that time frame, from the late 70s, early 80s to today, Alberta is growing into either the fourth or fifth largest, cattle feeding area in North America. Very similar to Colorado. The numbers can flip-flop between Colorado and Alberta in terms of, how many cattle are fed. So timing is everything in some respects. I was part of, the very early involvement when cattle just made an enormous amount of money. And that's why, if you just kept pushing all your money in year after year, you grew from not much, you keep doubling, right? You get to a pretty big number in a hurry. And I did not stop to build feedlots and to acquire farmland. So my model was distinctly different than many of my customers and other people, because they wanted to, own the feedlot, own the farmland. And I'm thinking, man, what's wrong with owning the cattle? Right? Like, there's massive returns into that, and the returns into the farming and the actual feedlot thing wasn't nearly as good. And in fact, the farming was horrible for many years. It was a decrease in working capital in many situations. So I avoided some of the things that, as producers, right, we typically like to, own our facilities and own our land and, all of this kind of thing. And it's that thinking that I was glad everyone else had that thinking, because it allowed me on the custom side just to go full bore, and I never ran out of places to feed the cattle.
So was custom feeding cattle at that time, was that really popular, or did you have a difficult time finding enough feeding capacity for what you were trying to do?
No, not at all. In Western Canada, it basically all started with custom feeding, right? The feedlots didn't own that big a share of the cattle, gradually. It changed dramatically over time. But for the first 20 years, all the money was, there's a lot of money in the cattle. If you were looking at it strictly financially, like I was, you had no incentive for owning farmland or feedlots. But as the industry matured over time, then you don't have those massive returns. And so you had to get involved in cattle ownership to make the whole thing work properly, right? And I still maintain you don't need to own the farmland. Others would disagree on that and say over a long period of time, it's okay. And that is true, right? Over a very long period of time, like a lifetime. I can't deal with that. I need cash flow. I'm looking at things that can make more rate of return. Lands, tends to be a storage of wealth as opposed to generation wealth. And I've tried to grow and grow all the time and have, and therefore the role of land in my portfolio is pretty minimal. And I wouldn't own feedlots either if I didn't have to, right? Because of, you needed to get to scale. Feedlots needed to get very large. And also production got considerably more complicated over time. And quite frankly, not all feedlots were up to it, right, in terms of changing, right? So we do very little custom, feeding now. All of our facilities, including calf ranches, calf depots, and various things we own. Again, just because we think that production is complicated enough, you've got to do everything right. And at times it can be difficult to get all of that on a custom basis.
So tell us, maybe when you bought the first feedlot, What was it that tipped you over the edge to shift your thinking from kind of the asset light version of your model to no, we need to own the feedlot? What was the tipping point there?
The tipping point was when big downturns occurred and the assets got worth considerably less than replacement value, right? So by then I was starting to read some of the success stories of other businesses and entities, and one of them has physical assets that are distressed. So every feedlot I've ever bought has been distressed to some extent. And where we made our significant move in the US, in the Texas Panhandle, that was post, the financial crisis, and things were not good. Feedlots were trading at almost a quarter of their replacement value, if not less. So it seemed like a good time to buy. And that's, it's a harsh way of looking at it, but it's like a golf course, right? Who makes money on the golf course? The third or fourth owner.
Same for most packing plants.
Yeah. Unfortunately, true there as well, right? So all assets work depending on how you buy them. But it was not just singularly because they were depressed. It was also because we wanted to fully control our own production. So whether they were distressed or not, ultimately we would have still owned feedlots.
So then just in terms of feeding cattle and navigating the commodity markets on the input and output side there, what were maybe one or two like really pivotal experiences in your journey that kind of shaped how you think about cattle ownership and managing risk, and maybe that is now informing how you're thinking even about Blackshirt?
Well, the first experience I had that was not good was in the spring of 1996. And what happened there was contra-seasonally, April was the low of the market, and corn prices, were north of $6, and feeder cattle went below $50, if you can believe that. Right. So it was a very substantial wreck that occurred, and it was the first time it ever happened to me. We had a very clear runway where I had no comprehension or interest in risk management, right? Because I think every time you touched the cattle, you made money until you didn't, which was the spring of 1996. So that was a watershed moment, because it somewhere during that time frame, I would have been technically insolvent, which always gets your attention, right? Because just of a massive loss where all of my inventory was concentrated in that time frame, because for the previous 20 years, that was the peak of the market, right? So pretty much everything that could go wrong went wrong, but it was an eye opener in the sense that you better be thinking about how do you mitigate some of the risk here? What can you do? Because up until that point in time, I paid no attention to risk management of any kind, because your returns wide open in the cash market had been so good.
Was anyone else paying attention to risk management, or it was unnecessary for everyone?
Yeah, in Western Canada, I think because of the profitability, there was less emphasis on risk management. But certainly a lot of the people around me had been, as they got bigger and bigger, at starting to look at it. And they were counseling me to have a look at it as well. But of course, I was too smart for all of that, right? So I didn't listen very well. And it was a very scary experience, but a useful one in the sense that it, put in perspective, what you needed to do to make sure that you don't become insolvent, during a massive wreck. And then once I started looking at it a little further and getting involved in consulting in the US and seeing what was going on, they'd periodically had their share of these things occur, right? And they were much more, I guess, realistic in terms of what could, how bad the situation could get. And I think the second one, which was a black swan event, that no amount of preparation could have helped, was the BSE event that we had here in Canada, where fat cattle prices got below 2 digits, and our losses cash to cash on cattle, were north of $1,000, right? So I mean, the whole market collapsed because Canada, we're 50% dependent on exports, roughly 90% of which went to the U.S. So when the borders closed, we had way too many cattle, not enough processing space, and all of the things that led to just a disaster on the price side. So I think that experience, taught me that there are things that can come along. And I mean, and the second black swan that we all got the COVID, right? So that was another black swan event, right? But what those things, taught me is that, you can be highly successful in doing what you're doing, but you're not bulletproof in terms of outside things that can come into play. So I think what it does is it sets you up, makes you more resilient so that you understand, I dealt with COVID a lot better than I dealt with BSE because that was version 2, right, of a major problem. And then your mindset and how you deal with it, it doesn't create, the levels of anxiety that you get on the first go around.
I can imagine. Is there, in any sort of commodity business, is there a way to be bulletproof?
Not that I know of. When I hear those terms about any business, we're bulletproof, we're this, we're that, and I'm thinking, you just haven't been around long enough to know what the black swan that will bash you over the head is going to be. And by the same token, I've seen businesses that have had a large degree of success due to a white swan, shall we say, and not really because of planning or, it was serendipity that led to success, and that got no issue with that. That's good. But as you better understand as the owner of the business, especially when you're thinking about expansion and so on, that how you got here was just luck. And we all as humans have a hard time, and we all like to think our success is because we're so brilliant, but a portion of it is luck and timing, right? It's just, there's no way to escape that.
Right. Man, that's so good. So that seems like a good transition point then. So tell us, you had all of this experience, these decades in cattle feeding, decades consulting. How has that transitioned and led to Blackshirt Feeders?
Yeah, that's been a lot of fun. So throughout the 40 years, I've never been involved in a greenfield site, right? Never built a feedlot, but certainly bought many and sold many and saw a variety of operations. And always I had in the back of my mind, it would be really great to synthesize all of this into, a new site and try to incorporate, all the best features of what you've seen over a long period of time. So we've been thinking about it, myself and my partners, for about 10 years, right? And a couple of things happened. One is that we ran out of feedlots that we could buy that were to scale. And in our minds, 50,000 is kind of a minimal scale that would interest me. As we've got involved in feedlots from as small as 5,000 head up to our largest site, which currently is 80,000 head, very big economies of scale all along the way, right? So we could see pretty clearly there was a message that build them bigger and your OPEX is going to go down. That's just inevitable in the feedlot business that happens. And also, again, through consulting, fortunate enough to see some of the operations and work with operations in Mexico that are 200 to 225,000 at a site. So knew that making them really large, we were able to see that this OPEX trend continued. So we thought, well, we need to find a place that we can build. We're not able to buy anything we like. Well, then your only other option is to build. And the other unique thing about Blackshirt is it really represents the best physical site, all things considered, that we could find in North America, right? And, the primary siting criteria of, what's the corn basis, what's the weather, where are the packing plants, all of those things that you should think about. And, the irony is in many cases, people built feedlots where they live. As it turns out, this was a very good site here in Western Canada, But it started because people built feedlots where they lived. And if you were fortunate enough to start building them in the right place, then it resulted in prosperity and continued growth, just like the Texas Panhandle, right? From first principles, a pretty good place to build feedlots. And so, the industry grew there. But there's also many feedlots that were put in areas that are pretty tough from the viewpoint of weather and packer location and all this kind of thing. So, we set about studying where we would build for about a year. And that's how we came up with, the site in Nebraska. And, things like water availability, corn basis, all of the primary siting criteria it met. So I think it's one of the largest greenfield sites that was intentionally built in a location that the owners thought was ideal. We're going to build that feedlot to, 150,000 head.
Okay. And there are some other unique things about that business model, right? I mean, talk to us more about what type of cattle, what's the ownership structure?
Yep. Yeah, there are a few things we, again, by traveling around and watching what happens in other parts of the world, we got very interested in roller compacted concrete. And we built, had added that to some of the feedlots that we have here in Western Canada. And briefly, it's basically regular concrete at a third the price because of the way that it's rolled as opposed to placed in the conventional methods with rebar. So essentially, you get concrete at a third of the price. And so that got very, very interesting because it's, you can use it to mitigate weather. And that's what allows you to put the feedlot in a location that you wouldn't have if you didn't have RCC, right, to get around the mud. So it's really helpful for mitigating the weather risk. And it's also a prerequisite if you're going to get involved with biodigesters. In order for the manure to stay clean enough, you pretty much have to put it on concrete. So remember I mentioned earlier that timing is everything. And when we put our first RCC in feedlots in Western Canada about 7 years ago, we weren't thinking about biodigestion.
That was just for the economics of feeding cattle.
Absolutely. We are driven by the performance of the cattle during adverse weather events, right? It's going to pay for itself and also reduce maintenance and all of that. So it was strictly a feedlot reason for doing it. And then the world changed with RNG, where because of the carbon credits and because, everybody wants to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040 or pick a number, those entities that want to do that have no way of decreasing their footprint unless they buy credits, right? So it resulted in this whole industry emerging around RNG, both on the dairy side and also on the beef cattle side. The dairies were ahead of us because the gas is more valuable, right? Same animal, but it's more valuable because of the reduced emissions around a lagoon. So they're getting credit for that. So there was many, many digesters built in conjunction with dairy operations. And feedlot operations were, hampered by the fact that the manure on dirt floor pens, you just can't do it. But you could do it on RCC. And so what we learned here in Canada was that, now you can build a digester and you're creating a revenue stream from something that would be normally be a bit of a cost center. Certainly a cost center here in Western Canada, even if you own the farmland, which we typically do not, right? So for us, it really is a cost center because we have to, get rid of the manure. So it allows us to, generate revenue from something that really has been a more of a cost center than it's been anything. And it gives you some other, opportunities as well, because this whole bioeconomy thing, the digestate that comes out is organic. By definition, it has the same nutrient profile as what went into the front end. And, it opens up, opportunities for developing organic fertilizer and, a whole host of other things. But it's really creating a revenue stream, an additional revenue stream for, for the feedlot. So that's been a pretty interesting aspect, to be developing that approach. And again, very doable in that location because of the proximity to the gas infrastructure. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you're not building a digester because you can't get the gas into the pipeline. Right back to the primary siting criteria, when we were looking for that site, we needed to look where we're going to get the gas into the line.
So another big bet that you've made is around the whole beef on dairy space. So talk to us a little bit more about that side of Blackshirt feeders.
Okay, just a little bit more of a background. I grew up in our ranch. We had Hereford seed stock. So my father started his purebred herd in 1943. So I was raised around seed stock and showing cattle and all that good stuff. Never thought it would be much value as I've got into the feedlot space, right? Because I thought, well, yeah, I know some cattle are way better than others, but phenotypically that's pretty hard to sort out, right? And I'm just buying feeder cattle just like everybody else. They're in the witness protection program, basically. So observed that over the years, made efforts to try to do alliances in the beef cattle sector, never really succeeded at scale. I think the biggest program we have with cow-calf operators would be about 20 to 30,000 head into our system annually. That's where, we know the sire of the calves, and we followed those calves through in a retained ownership program, and we've, been able to I mean, that's not much after 40 years of trying, right? It's just a drop in the bucket of our feeder cattle requirements. Are those better cattle in average? Yes, they are. So, I mean, we're not in denial here that you can find better cattle. So when this whole Beyond D thing started to emerge, and basically it was 2011, I think 2010 or 2011, when first started to think about this. It's not like it's new information that a native crossed with a dairy animal would be better than the dairy animal, right? I mean, everyone knew that, but what catalyzed the whole thing was the emergence of sex semen. So suddenly now a dairy farmer can, go after elite genetics to generate his next crop. And in most situations, they can have up to 40 to 50% of the calves can be bred to a beef bull. So suddenly you've got a whole population of animals out there that you can actually know what the genetics are, right? So finally I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. I'm finally going to be able to utilize, something from involvement with seed stock, that would be worthwhile here. So I started to figure out, all right, how are we going to, organize a supply chain so that we own the animals from birth all the way through the calf ranch, the feedlot, and so on, because that's the only way that you can monetize the thing properly and select the bulls that are doing the best job throughout the entire system. So I got very, very interested in that early because I thought now I've got a chance to materially create a supply that's significant in our population, with known genetics, right? And not only known, but the ability to use best of or superior genetics in those cattle. So, we got all over that in the beginning, and the Beyond D cattle will, today probably represent about 75% of our entire fed population, right? So we've been working at it, very exciting when you can line up the cattle and look at the various bulls, and you can literally create thousands of offspring from a single bull. And you can see pretty clearly, how it lines up to what your expectation was, and you can get involved in, the genetic side. And we have a partnership with VERO on producing bulls that we want for this Beyond D process. And VERO, as you probably are aware of, have purchased Leachman, and that combination is producing the bulls, for us on a proprietary basis. right? So the bulls that they're producing for us, the semen's not for sale elsewhere, right? So we have our own lineup of bulls that we've contracted them to build for us. So not only can you have genetic separation, you have separation that's sustainable, right? It's more of a pig model, right, where you control the grandfather stock. That's how we looked at it. So very exciting. And this whole lifetime analysis is wonderful too, right? Where you can look at everything from birth all the way through, and you can improve production in all areas of that you're working because you have the data, right? And we also have the software and it's not like we had to go and build a bunch of stuff here. We already have it, right? For tracking way through. We have, very, very high powered data analytics and people to mine the information in this very large system. It really lends itself well to, some of the newer things out there. We're looking at the application of AI, with this massive amount of data to see where, can it give us further insights that are actionable or that are monetizable.
What are you finding so far?
Haven't had too many eureka moments with it, but we're in the early stages of training it, right? At least right now it's coming up with the same conclusions that our more standard analytics have done. So it's reinforced well what we currently know or we understand. And in order to, take it to some of the next steps, you got to make sure that it can do what we currently do, right? So we're working our way through that. I think some of the first applications will actually come on things like I mentioned before, all of these images that come in on the necropsy side. I think AI is going to be able to make the diagnosis there. I think we're getting very close to being able to do that, and that's so handy because we consume a lot of DVM time in looking at images. It's a great training tool, but after you've looked at the first 100,000, you may have had enough of that too, right? So if AI can help us out there, I think it's going to be probably our first use case for the technology.
Make it faster, make it more precise, all of those things. It is amazing to me how your career has just come so full circle, and some of those early principles that made feedlot health so successful are now coming to bear in completely new ways and taking it to even further, just, I don't want to say extremes in a bad way, but just taking it to new endpoints there with Blackshirt. The thing that strikes me most about what you've done, Kee, across your multiple businesses is the business model innovation. So what are some of the principles that you try to keep in mind as you think about business model innovation?
I think one of the primary things is, be data driven and science based. Making sure that I stick to that has been highly beneficial. And I'll just use an example, right? I get approached quite a bit to invest in things outside of agriculture, right? And so I've listened to a lot of pitches about, and even within agriculture in the VC space. What I find is that once I get out of the wheelhouse of what I know something about, beef cattle, if I get outside of that, I'm in big trouble, right? In terms of being able to assess what people are saying and being able to understand, is this really a valid idea? Is this innovation something that, or perceived innovation, is it real? Right. Well, the only place I can assess that is right in what I know something about, and that's beef cattle and feedlot production. I'm looking for innovations in other sectors in the broad sense, and I think, how does that really apply to what I'm doing? And the answer is very infrequently, right? Because these innovations that truly are, and some of them are true innovations in other things, just really don't translate well into the beef cattle world. And the best example I can think of is that, 41 years ago when I first started, the best way for pen checking was to get on your horse, separate out the ones that didn't quite look right, and bring them to the hospital and stick a thermometer to them. Guess what? We do that today. Today, that is still the best method, despite all of the technology that's been tried to be applied to this thing. And so there's some very promising things in the last while in terms of the readable tags and cameras and various things. But at the end of the day, there is no innovation there to adopt that I can make money from today. But I can just see, and I watch people get very enthusiastic about some of the stuff and just pile money into it and go, I know this is going to be an innovation. It's going to change the pen checking world. Well, something will eventually. Wearables have become a huge part of the dairy production. They fit there. That's worked. But, how is this thing really going to work for me in the beef cattle sector? So I think we have to be careful when we're assessing innovation. And one thing to remember too is that primary innovation is somewhat rare. Where you make money day to day is in getting ideas that are out there and just making sure your execution and how you implement it is superior. That's the key thing. I mean, I take it back 41 years ago. I mean, in vet college, everyone was talking about herd health, right? And production medicine. Talked about for 10 years before I graduated. It was not my idea, but I figured out how to implement it. So I said, there's the idea. I like that idea. I can make it work, right? And sometimes people get confused as what was the innovation and who was the innovator. A lot of times, who took advantage of it wasn't the primary innovator of the ideas. And sometimes you can hardly remember who it was or where that primary idea came from. Someone asked me here, one of the vet students that was around on one of some rotations said, how did you get the idea to charge on a per head day basis? That seems pretty interesting. And I'm thinking, can't remember that. I'm not sure if it was my original idea or not. I can't even remember. But a lot of people think it was because I was the first person here in Canada that made it successful. But honestly, I couldn't tell you if that was one of my primary ideas or not.
But it seems like that just makes the case even more of exposing ourselves to outside ideas from other industries, other geographies, other proteins. I mean, even when you were talking about that you had seen a 50,000 head feed yard in Mexico, I didn't realize there was feed yards that large anywhere. So it's super interesting then even to see borrowing that concept and implementing it.
Yeah, it really helps you de-risk what you're doing, because then you know that a feedlot at that scale has been successful. It makes yourself a lot better sleeping at night when you're about to spend the amount of money that you're not doing something that just isn't going to work or just doesn't make sense. So, traveling to me and not only looking at beef cattle production operations, but any opportunity that I have to look at an agricultural operation anywhere on the planet, I'm going. Whether it's grape farmers in California or there's always something that you should be able to take a thing or two out of what you're seeing and think about, does this apply? Or let's think about it if it does apply, and then ultimately we'll likely have to test whether it's the right idea or not. And with our large research infrastructure, we can, take some of those ideas and get them tested before they end up costing us a lot of money. Because on the surface, it looks like, a cool thing or the right thing to be doing. A lot of times it's not, and you would have no way of knowing that unless you looked at it pretty carefully.
Wow. Well, that's such a good note for us to end on, because I know I've gotten multiple takeaways from the discussion, and I know the Future of Ag listeners will as well. So Kee, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Jeanette, and we'll look forward to visiting with you as we travel, because you have the habit of showing up in very interesting places. Okay. So very good. Have a great day. Thank you.
Well, a fantastic interview there with Dr. Kee Jim. Thank you very much to him for being on the show. Thank you, of course, to Jeanette Barnard as well for bringing that story to us and conducting that interview. That was really, really fascinating. In fact, it was difficult because I had to cut some parts out. I tried to keep this under an hour as an episode, and so I cut a few things out that I really wish we could share. So what I'm going to do is post the interview in its entirety to the Future of Agriculture YouTube channel. which brings up a good point. I have a Future of Agriculture YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed, you should do that. I'll leave a link for that in the show notes where you can go subscribe. I'm posting regularly clips from episodes. I will post clips from this one, but I'll make sure I capture everything that was not included in the full episode. Since you've made it this far, you've heard all that, but you can go back, watch the clips, and catch some stuff specifically about methane and specifically about beef on dairy. There were more interesting aspects to that story that I unfortunately had to leave out to keep this thing within time. But anyway, thank you again to Case IH for being our quarterly presenting sponsor. And last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I really do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.